The title of the book we're talking about is Tropic of Kansas. My novel that came out last summer that had two different reviewers called it the Feel Bad Book of the Year. Well, one called it the Brilliant Feel Bad Book of the Summer. And the other one called it the Feel Bad Book of the Year, which I thought was kind of funny, actually, and I think they meant it in a good way.
This time, on 20 Minutes into the Future, John Lebkowski and Scoop Sweeney conduct a wide-ranging discussion with author Christopher Brown. Brown's dystopian novel, Tropic of Kansas, received critical acclaim for its dark vision of an America made not so great again by a tyrannical new government.
In this episode, we will be interviewing Christopher Brown, who asks the musical question, what if the revolutions we watch ripping other countries apart were happening on our own streets?
Right on. Thanks for having me, John.
Happy to have you here.
Thanks, Scoop.
Well, I enjoyed reading the book. I just finished reading it a few days ago, and my wife is a big fan of yours now, not because she read the book, because it got me out of her hair for a whole week. So, obviously I stuck with it. It was a great read.
Indeed. I have shied away from dystopian fiction of late. And I was fascinated by the sort of level of dystopia in this particular novel. And also in the piece that you wrote called Dystopia is Real.
Yeah, dystopia is realism. Exactly. Yeah.
The future is here if you look closely. So I'm wondering about your own fascination with dystopian fiction, or is it a fascination? Is this something that you're feeling that you want to binge on a little bit? It sounds like your next novel may also flutter around that particular area.
Well, it's a good question, John. And in the book, I should mention the title, I guess. The title of the book we're talking about is Tropic of Kansas. My novel that came out last summer that had two different reviewers called it the Feel Bad Book of the Year. Well, one called it the Brilliant Feel Bad Book of the Summer. The other one called it the Feel Bad Book of the Year, which I thought was kind of funny, actually, and I think they meant it in a good way. And I was at the Virginia Festival of the Book just this weekend, and somebody in the audience asked, I was on a panel with a Spanish novelist and another U.S. novelist. We each had different sorts of dark books, and this question from the audience was, how do you know when to dial up or dial down or turn off the bleakness to not alienate the reader? But to me, I didn't set out to write a dystopian novel. I set out to write a book that would be kind of a repurposing of some of the tropes of adventure fiction, trying to do with those kinds of stories a little bit of sort of what Cormac McCarthy does with Western material, if you will, not to suggest that I am quite at that level, but and to take the material of sort of the post 9/11 reality and do a kind of a big inversion with it, to use the phrase, the term that the English writer J.G. Ballard liked to talk about, where he often analogized it to sort of when he was an anatomy student, to sort of opening up the cadaver and kind of seeing what's inside. And so I think what I was trying to do with Tropic of Kansas was sort of take a look at the contemporary post 9/11 U.S. and kind of cut it open down the sternum and turn it inside out a little bit through the counterfactual prism of, speculative fictional alternate history. Imagine, as you said in the outset, sort of what would happen if, if the things we see going on in Syria were going on here, as they sometimes increasingly feel like they're about to happen, and take a look at that and sort of take a look at it through the viewpoint of a couple of characters who exist outside of power. And I think when you take a kind of an honest look, whether it's sort of in a realist way, and maybe even more so if you look at it through a kind of imaginative literary way, there's a lot of darkness there, and everything in the book is an effort by me to describe the world as I saw it around me in the period when I was writing it, and sort of 2013 and 14, and I think that if it gets called prescient by some people, it's because it's really just, as you said, John, it's kind of like the Gibsonian aphorism that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. In this case, it's like the dystopia is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. A lot of people are living in pretty dystopian conditions in this country. Some of them are aware of it, some are not. And I'm trying to talk about that through the context of what simultaneously tries to be an entertaining story, is kind of what that book's about. And you might call it dystopian, but in some respects it's also trying to find its way to being a utopian story. But I think from the publisher's perspective, it's dystopia that sells.
Well, I did find myself wondering, I obviously I was responsive to the dark tone of the book and to the, sort of bleak vision of the future and of the area that was called the Tropic of Kansas in the book. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I wondered if I sort of imagined that you weren't thinking, hey, I'm going to write a dystopian novel, but as you say, that you were thinking of combining some elements and writing a particular fiction, and that it just sort of took its course. Is that not the case?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to write a story in which a kind of armed revolution was going on in the United States, or a sort of, a genuine popular uprising. And I was like, well, if that were going to happen, for that to happen, things would need to be a lot worse. And so I just sort of, looked around me at the places where it was already pretty bad and tried to dial it up a little bit. You sort of, kind of change the mix of reality a little bit. And so that was really the purpose. And so the dystopia sort of comes from that. But it's just drawing from things that I think are already extant, whether they are the sort of ecological exhaustion of the once bounteous heartland that our ancestors settled or immigrated to, and or the way in which the culture of corporate life and of the adoration of the figure of the kind of tyrannical CEO has infected our politics. The way that our politics and our kind of popular media culture have become kind of completely blurred and intermixed. Sort of, way beyond what Ballard talked about of, politics as a branch of advertising, into like politics is like a bad copy of Fox News or something, and or as a branch of spam marketing, and so on. So trying to kind of explore those things and imagine, how bad would it have to be here for us to really have real change beyond the kind of change that our legacy partisan politics can imagine. And
yeah, I guess the trajectory of the character Tanya is kind of interesting, because she initially is not really thinking she's going to become a revolutionary or throw herself into a revolution, but you can see sort of how she progresses, and really her inherent morality, I think, sort of takes her in a direction that's really inevitable for her, but certainly not something that she would have foreseen for herself.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the idea. And I mean, maybe it's helpful to kind of give a brief discussion of what the kind of the trajectory of the story is, where it follows a kind of a homeless teenager named Sig, who's been living as a fugitive on the other side of the Canadian border due to the political activities of his parents. And the book opens when he's sort of nabbed by the Canadian law enforcement and deported back across into a United States that's been walled off from the other side, where he's detained in a kind of Minnesota Guantanamo, escapes, and then finds himself on the run through the titular Tropic of Kansas, the sort of part of the American heartland that's gone third world, trying to get to the supposed sanctuary of New Orleans is the one place that the sort of rebels have managed to secure as an autonomous zone. And his foster sister, who's a Washington lawyer named Tanya, gets coerced by the government after a security breach on her part into trying to track down her ornery brother. And in the process of kind of going undercover in the underground, starts to kind of question her own loyalties, and try to give the reader a point of view into how we all learn to see outside of our own particular view from nowhere, as it were.
She has a lot of aha moments. The character Sig feels almost superheroic to me in the sense that it seems like he should have died about 5 different times in the course of the story. He's beat up pretty badly along the way. You almost can't imagine how he survives all of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the character, most of the injuries that character suffers, or other than gunshot wounds or injuries, I have experienced myself. So I was, again, trying to have a level of realism in there, but maybe I've been banged up more than most.
Well, maybe you're a superhero.
No, I'm definitely not that. And, I certainly don't have the magical healing power. But I have. But I think the characters in the book they draw heavily on kind of deep archetypes of American folklore. The character of Sig has a lot of that sort of the backwoodsman of the frontier character that runs deep in American culture, the figure that embodies the kind of liminal space between human settlement and the frontier, and trying to do it in a way that taps into kind of contemporary Anthropocene American ecological conditions.
Yeah, he's sort of like a Hugh Glass character, a Hugh Glass from The Revenant.
Yeah. Yeah, he's a little bit of that. He's a little bit of a feral kid. I mean, he's got a little, there's a little bit of a. I have a good friend who is a guy kind of recovering from homelessness, who lives not far from me in an abandoned building that he's been living in for 10 years. And he read the book, and he was the first to note the extent to which the character of Sig made him think of both Walker Percy and the forgotten Tarzan knockoff Bomba the Jungle Boy.
Oh, I remember Bomba really well.
And so there is a little bit of that, Mowgli, Tarzan, Huck Finn, whatever.
Well, Chris, if you read history, real histories of revolutionaries, many of them, if not most of them, didn't really, go down to the revolutionary recruiting office and say, I want to sign up. They just sort of developed into it. And that's what I see happening to your characters. The people who really, you wouldn't think they were going to be revolutionaries, but it just sort of, as it happens in real life, it just worked out that way.
Well, exactly. And the kind of the real history that I coupled with this archetypal material and just with the sui generis qualities of the characters was the great work that the English historian Eric Hobsbawm did on social bandits. Hobsbawm had this book I've always loved called Bandits that follows and kind of defines a trajectory that you can see in a lot of cultures all over the world where under certain circumstances, a common thief will become a social bandit, sort of this sort of, Robin Hood figure, right? Robbing from power on behalf of the people, right? With a kind of redistributive aim and maybe simultaneously a self-interested aim. And then may ultimately evolve into a revolutionary. And I think that's the idea, exactly to your point, Scoop, that it's sort of trying to imagine that sort of natural trajectory occurring in the way that it can. And it's interesting because if you look at, American popular culture, we don't have that many figures of social bandits who really morph into the revolutionary figures in the way that some other cultures do. We don't even have that many sort of social bandit figures. You can look around. There are a few, criminals who become kind of folk heroes, right? Sort of Bonnie and Clyde had a little bit of that. Dillinger had a little bit of that.
Then we had Patty Hearst.
Yeah, Patty Hearst, right.
That's a whole different kettle of fish.
Yeah, well, and that's actually one of the ideas in this book is that Tanya's parents named her after Patty Hearst's nom de guerre.
That didn't register on me for some reason, but that is
no, it wouldn't. It's the idea is a lot of this alternate historical detail is sort of deeply embedded. But.
Well, I was reading some of your essays, and you seem to have started at an early age introducing yourself, either intentionally or unintentionally, to dystopian cultures and revolution when you were quite a bit younger. Could you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's true. I have had a pretty varied series of experiences, including working in Washington, like right out of high school and on through my 20s in varying degrees, all in the United States Senate, which included such bizarre experiences as having deep dish pizza with the vampiric figure of Strom Thurmond, which is about as dystopian as it gets. But being kind of very, getting that sort of exposure to power. And then, and in this book, it was very heavily influenced by a trip I took as a young student journalist in the 80s during the years of the wars in Central America, and took a bus from New Orleans through Houston to Laredo, and then picked up the old Aguila Azteca train that you could get for $24 in Nuevo Laredo down to Mexico City, and then traveled with a buddy as student journalists by bus from Mexico City through Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua when things were really crazy, and saw both the really dark conditions of guerrilla war and government oppression across ethnic lines that were going on in Guatemala, and documented some of that. Saw the kind of spooky American presence, both official and uniformed, and unofficial and out of uniform, in Honduras, and then we were in Nicaragua during the 5th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution.
Wow!
And what was this sort of effort at utopia that was not entirely succeeding, as is common with real world experiments in utopia.
They never seem to succeed, do they?
No, they never seem to succeed. And, and in their case, the very limited access to the kind of global economy and to just the kind of goods. And like I remember, I was a smoker at the time, and I remember the filters on the government cigarettes were made of sawdust, and which somehow seemed emblematic of where they were at. But the old downtown of Managua had been this, it had been the colonial heart of the country. And then in the earthquake of 1972, it was almost entirely reduced to rubble. And Somoza stole all the reconstruction funds from the international community, and so it never got rebuilt. And when we got there, we were like, two gringos full of their own baloney, and we have the ride from pick up a taxi at the bus station and tell them to take us to El Centro. And so we go to El Centro and we find the one little, flop house that's left. And it's like literally like spending the night in a post-apocalyptic ruin. And you go for a walk and there's just like overgrown wild grasses everywhere, and sort of the shells of buildings. You'd see like people off in these buildings like cooking by fire in an oil drum, and like you'd see like a Sherman tank sitting there half kind of sucked back into the earth and tagged with graffiti. And that experience, it was sort of like, it was very much the experience of witnessing firsthand at a young age, 18 or 19, the same kind of, apocalyptic landscape that I had been exploring in, my juvenile reading and kind of goofy role-playing games as a teenager before I went there. And that very much is present in the book, and in trying to take some of those things I saw and sort of transplant them to the U.S.
Did they have any kind of middle class there?
Sure they did. I mean, they had a substantial middle class. I mean, and that's part of why the revolution failed and part of why it succeeded. I think in part, I'm no historian of Nicaragua, but what was evident to me from what I've learned while visiting there and read at the time was that, the Sandinistas had been out in the jungles fighting for a Marxist revolution for more than 2 decades. But the victory came in part when the classically liberal middle class were alienated by Somoza to the point where they sort of all joined forces, and even a large segment of the business community and so on, like the Chamorro family who owned the big newspapers and so on. And so when we were there, after we spent our night in the ruins of El Centro, we stayed in a hotel in another part of town in a more 70s kind of ranch house, like suburbia land, full of, something resembling middle class living. And there were all these conservative politicians in part staying in that hotel who were basically rural landowners coming into town, and they were still participating in government in various ways. They were sharing the hotel with Russian engineers who at night would play chess and listen to Michael Jackson tapes in the hotel lounge. And then you had the kind of urban middle class or patrician class, if you will, of Managua. And ultimately what happened was in around 1990 was the kind of bourgeois Managuans parted with the Sandinistas, who they thought were being too sort of intransigently ideological and trying to and forced elections, and one of them won. I think it was one of the members of the Chamorro family won, so yeah, it was certainly a formative and influential experience.
I've always been sort of fascinated by the blinders of the middle classes, or how whole classes of people can be hidden within a society. The whole sort of underclass poverty. I used to work in poverty programs, and I was very aware that there were whole neighborhoods of people like within the city where I was working that were completely invisible to the members of the middle to upper middle class. They weren't even aware they were there.
Totally. And I mean, we see it I think you see it in any community in the U.S. I think that we all tend to be, I mean, for starters, most of us are raised and, we kind of come up in the whatever social context we come up in, and we don't see beyond the universe of, what we experience, say, in our schools, right?
Yeah.
And our families. And then as adults, we sort of get on our work and life trajectory. And again, I think that we don't see much beyond kind of what the economic reality is of the neighborhood we live in usually. And I think that the myopia that creates is pretty politically debilitating for.
Yeah, definitely problematic. I mean, you have, as we have in the U.S. now, the perspective of someone who totally watches Fox News constantly versus the perspective of a person who watches MSNBC versus the perspective of someone who isn't really all that literate and doesn't watch the news at all. I mean, all of these people are supposed to be part of the same society and in some way working together, but they're not. I mean, they're completely, there's a division there.
And the change, the kind of post-World War II changes in sort of geographic mobility and urbanization, and the change in, the kind of the economics of agriculture and so on, a lot of which is sort of, in this book, has caused like immense brain drain from places that, before World War II, like, small towns in Iowa or whatever, which were sort of the kind of the vibrant and healthy and diverse, both from a class and education and, job expertise point of view that you can see in, portrayed in the cinema of, the mid 20th century. And, you go to places now like the traveling through, say, rural Iowa, or rural Missouri or Kansas. And there are a lot of places that just look kind of almost abandoned. And that's some of what I was trying to describe in the book. And when the elections happened, it was sort of like I saw this map that showed kind of county by county how the vote had gone, and you could really see how much of it was driven by those kinds of factors.
One of the things that's driving a lot of the bubbling up discontent is the G word, gentrification. You see it in Austin and in my old neighborhood in the Bay Area. It's gone beyond unbelievable in the Bay Area, where basically if you're not a CEO, you can't find a place to rent.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember my first job in a software company in the 90s, being taught by the guys who were working in our California part of the business, who told me that, if you work out here in San Jose, or wherever between San Jose and the Valley and San Francisco, like you need to have the successful hit with some stock options just to be able to buy a house and kind of get into a neighborhood where your kids can get a decent education. And this was 15 years before people were throwing rocks at the Google bus, and I mean, it's sort of astonishing. My own neighborhood in East Austin, where I've been 10 years now, and we moved out here. The only thing we displaced to move to our place was an abandoned Chevron petroleum pipeline. This was kind of a brownfield that we rehabilitated. But I've gotten my evil lawyer twin, as it were, who's gotten pretty involved in some of the neighborhood issues over here, and I've learned a great deal about about those struggles, and some of the tools we have to combat them. But how hard it is fundamentally to fight against the trends that are just driven by capital infiltrating into places where it thinks it can create more value, and all of the people who act as its instruments without really kind of thinking through what they're doing. I mean, I've come to the view that in some respects, real estate professionals are the darkest engine of American history, and that until we kind of figure out how to rethink our approach to housing and getting everybody hooked on the home mortgage as the ultimate payday loan, that we'll never really be able to solve our problems. And we live in a country where a third of the people in the U.S. don't even have a bank account. That's something that I dealt with in another professional capacity for a few years, and when you first hear that statistic, it's sort of like shocking, which is like, I guess it's like a big chunk of those have a bank account, but they never use it. But there's just this huge chunk of the population that's living on, sort of paycheck to paycheck. They may have, $100 or a couple $100 in their pocket at any given time, and just kind of, living day to day in that sort of state of absolute precarity. And
they just get the check and cash it, right?
Yeah, they get the check and they go down to HEB or to the check casher and cash it, pay a little fee, but don't have to pay bounce check fees, and they kind of have the cash in hand and kind of navigate through life that way. They can go pay their landlord and pay their gas bill and, hope they can make it to next month.
Well, the cliche has always been the country was, 2 or 3 paychecks away from revolution, if you miss your paychecks. But that didn't seem to really play out in the last election, because there are a lot of people who were less than 2 or 3 paychecks. I mean, they were, the heavy Trump territories were also heavily, distressed. People are unemployed. There's no work. There's no housing. There's not much of anything. But for some reason, they saw a new Messiah. And
I think that's it's a great point, and it is, because that was always the joke. Yeah, the 2 or 3 paychecks from revolution, and or 2 or 3 missed meals, right? And I don't know. I think that would work if there were coherent institutions of community that allowed people to share their experience and to realize that they had sort of tools, democratic tools, sort of short of revolutionary tools or peaceful revolutionary tools to deal with those things. But I don't know that we have, again, sort of as a condition in part of geographic mobility and the way we kind of move around and the way that kind of families kind of fly to the winds. I don't know that we have the kind of community institutions that let people really organize easily. And I keep waiting for our techno-utopian opportunities through digital networks to kind of fill that gap. But and it's happening in some respects, I suppose. I think that social media and digital communications has helped facilitate some of these mass protests we've seen. Like, I was in Washington last weekend after going up to Charlottesville for the Virginia Festival of the Book. My wife came up and we were able to participate in the march on Saturday, which is pretty amazing. And I mean, that women's march we had in Austin last year was in the largest public assembly ever in the history of Texas. Those are profound things, but
it was really interesting in your book that you had this whole network that they had built, that they had evolved, that was completely hidden.
Yeah, I liked the way you used retro technology, the blanking interval in the TV signal, and analog communications. Something that I'm a bit of a nut on that. In addition to being heavily digitized myself, but I love old technology. I love the way you use that. What made you decide to send that network into a more retro technology direction?
I don't, it's partly just fun, and I like the grainy aesthetic of the cathode ray tube, technology and AM radio and stuff like that. I mean, I've always gotten a kick out of that, and I think that on one level, it was sort of a way to kind of talk about how disappointing it's been for me to see how quickly so much of the utopian possibility of the web and associated digital technologies were kind of completely co-opted by capital. And in the world of this book, what's happened is there isn't really the internet as we know it doesn't really exist in that world. It's a world where basically the kind of the dream that AT&T had in the early 90s of a sort of commercial interactive television network is sort of what fills that gap. And that's a way of sort of talking about how really corporate our kind of media structure is. And we certainly see it now where we're all, unpaid serfs hustling on the treadmill of these social media platforms that allow us to communicate with each other about matters of shared political concern, but at the same time are just sort of feeding the machine and giving us some illusion of action and in fact just a lot of distraction from kind of really doing anything about anything.
Social media seems to be a double-edged. Social media seems to have turned into a double-edged sword of being good. If you want to keep track with your kids and mom and dad, but it's the negative part of bad actors like Russia getting involved in the mix and turning it in a whole different direction. And that's kind of the problem with social media. There's some good and some bad involved.
Yeah, I mean, it's, but they're amoral. It's like most technology platforms. They're sort of fundamentally amoral. They're governed by the duty of the managers, the board of directors and the senior management to maximize shareholder value. Culturally, my experience with those companies, I've worked in the technology business a long time, kind of going back to the birth of the web. Culturally, it sort of tends to be people practicing consumer marketing as a branch of mathematics, and with the amorality that goes with that, it's not an entirely new thing. I mean, I think if you look at pre-digital means of marketing and manipulating consumer behavior, whether it's through television advertising or through direct mail, which, is certainly in politics, there's a, deep history of people doing very similar kinds of individual profiling to target direct mail and to target messaging and to know, whether it's marketing credit cards or marketing politicians, which words will get people most excited and likely to take action.
There's a perspective where you could say that that's really a good thing, that we're able to turn a lot of product and it creates a vibrant economy and people are getting paid and, the whole point of persuasion is to keep those engines rolling,
Yeah. I mean, I think what would be really promising would be if we could figure out how to do a better job as communities on those platforms of engaging in the governance of those platforms. Because, the bulk of the market cap value of Facebook or Twitter is in the content created by the users and the users themselves. You can see how, Facebook lost, $50 billion in value just over fear of a loss of users.
Yeah.
I think if the users could organize and sort of, collectively bargain for better governance, something short of, a kind of cooperative model user-owned platform, which sort of might really be the ticket. But I think there's an opportunity to create something that has a lot more of a modeling of, a kind of incipient direct democracy, which I think could have the potential to really help ameliorate some of the pressures and disaffections in our politics, because I think people want a more authentically participatory system, and they don't feel like they have it. And to Scoop's earlier comment, the last election felt more just like a retributive lashing out of people who feel kind of completely disenfranchised by the whole culture and sort of forgotten. And it's almost like, oh, we'll put this guy in and he'll make all of you affluent people in the cities feel the same pain as us, right?
If you want to
kind of nabbed the wrong guy, but their thinking was spot on. I mean, the problem of the corporate dominated world is that you have this terrible asymmetry, where the so if we're, say, consumers of product, consumers have little power and the corporations have more power. And there's ways to address that. Doc Searles has this thing called vendor relationship management, which is about trying to use technology to create a more symmetrical sort of distribution of power, where the consumers have more power in their relationship with suppliers or vendors or whatever. And then there's the co-op model, which, of course, I espouse, which allows workers to have a sort of democratic workplace where they're participating in profits and governance. And I think that that's the really helpful stuff. And on the technical side would be replacing like Facebook and Twitter with indie web kind of stuff. I mean, the indie web is about giving people the tools to create the kind of sharing and interaction that they've been getting from Facebook, but to do it without involving some large corporation that's mediating that social space for them.
Mm-hmm.
But
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I wanted to ask you a different thing about your book.
Yeah.
I have the sense that there's a significant backstory that you had to think through. I've noted that it's sort of like like we think of science fiction as being futuristic, but this is more of an alternative presence. And it seems that history forked in 1981 with President Reagan being not just shot, but also killed, assassinated. And it appears that Alexander Haig became president at one point. Have I got that history right?
You do, and I made the choice in the writing of the book and in the telling of the story to keep most of the deep sort of backstory occluded, because I don't think that this sort of the extensive exposition aids story. I think that that it's better to kind of keep that embedded in the negative space of the text, as it were.
Well, that's really powerful too. I was just wondering, to what extent did you have to work out the backstory before you actually wrote the main story?
I had a pretty extensive backstory I wrote to be able to kind of know what the operating rules of that world were. And I mean, basically it started with George H.W. Bush was killed during World War II when his plane was downed in the Pacific. So his son did not exist in that world, and he did not exist in that world. So he was not the vice president when Ronald Reagan was shot. The hostages had not been released in the October surprise, and so and the idea is that Alexander Haig was the vice president for Ronald Reagan, and he when he took power, there was a sort of more militaristic approach that a bunch of the hostages got killed by the Iranians, and there was a big backlash, and the world sort of set off on a very much darker course, and other collateral effects like AT&T not being broken up in the mid '80s as it was in our universe, and all the impact that had on our telecommunications infrastructure and the kind of the media structure of the society and so on. And so on, and that stuff is, I think it's kind of fun to play with. I think that one of the things you find, John Crowley, the great writer of science fiction, fantasy, imaginative literature, however you want to situate him. He wrote a great essay that was republished in a book that came out just this past year called Totalitopia. And he talks about when he set out to start writing, stories set in the future, that a good rule of thumb from the writer's point of view was that it was almost always the case that if you kind of flipped on their head what all of the popular assumptions were about what the future would look like, it was the best way to kind of come up with both what was an interesting story to tell and what was likely to happen. And perhaps more importantly, to your question, that and one that I think is really true for the kind of futurism of today, which is that a lot of the future, a good source for imagining what the future is going to look like is to look at the past. And so in this book, you get this kind of atemporal, indeterminate sense of when it is taking place, because in some respects, there's some things that are really retro, like people playing around with beat up old TVs as the means of, underground media and liberation, and things that seem futuristic, like these kinds of ubiquitous drones, that are in some cases autonomous. The idea of that, sort of humans versus robots, and it's just kind of there. It's not even that remarkable from the viewpoint of the characters, but things that I think are, they're around us now. They're just you just kind of change up the mix a little bit, and hopefully find some interesting territory.
One of the things you wrote in one of your essays was basically the statement that that dystopia isn't a real place, but you can see it from here.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that, as I was saying, the Tropic of Kansas of the title is not a real place, but you can see it from here, or I can see it from here for sure. I mean, we were just talking about all of the folks in the United States who live just kind of on the edge of total disaster on a day-to-day basis, and then think about people in other parts of the world, and I think you can see it in our politics. You can see how easy it is to find yourself in a really dark place. I mean, I had a really interesting experience. I'm working on a new book that's sort of set in nominally the same universe. It's more of a story of a criminal defense lawyer in a kind of United States drifting into totalitarianism. The elevator pitch was Better Call Saul meets 1984. But in the part of the research, that one of the things I read, partly just kind of a random find, was Norman Mailer's book, Miami and the Siege of Chicago, where he goes to, he goes to the political conventions of 1968, which is now 50 years ago. And you reading those stories of kind of what the conditions like were then, of a sense of a nation on the brink of an uprising, of, a horrific war going on, of they go to Chicago, and here's like basically like a fascist tyrant mayor with this, armed police force on him, doing things like, throwing people through the plate glass windows of the Conrad Hilton into the, journalists and political muckety mucks. And I've been reading about periods in which martial law really was declared in the United States. Like, not like reading it in science fiction books, but going and finding it in treatises at the law library, right? And all of that stuff's out there, and yeah, it's just a matter of a sort of I don't know. You put the funhouse mirror up to the world we live in, and it's pretty easy to see some of its qualities that normally are kind of maintained below, kind of sub rosa, if you will.
I found myself thinking of your book as sort of a case study of what might happen to the U.S. if Trump became suddenly much smarter.
Yeah, right. Well, I wrote the book, right? So we haven't even really talked about the fact that one of the things I imagined as I was writing the book in 2013 and 14 was imagined a darkly charismatic businessman who becomes a fascist American president. And actually, when I finished it, like around Thanksgiving of 2014, I sort of sat on the book for a while because I was sort of like, oh man, nobody's ever going to believe this.
Just wait a couple of years and everyone will believe it.
Yeah. And he was supposed to be, as I imagined him, he was more like kind of Mitt Romney meets John McCain meets like, Tom Cruise or something, right? Kind of more, to your point, John, more competent, more scary. And the model of what we've historically thought of our presidents as being is typically sort of maybe people were terrified of in some cases, but competent and at some baseline. And so yeah. And then when the election started going, I was sort of like, oh man, I better get this out there. The sort of real world is catching up to me. Yeah, so I think that idea, John, of the CEO president is one that's been around for a long time and been kind of kicking around. I mentioned Mitt Romney. He was totally that example, the Bain Capital guy and Olympic turnaround artist as CEO in chief. And both of the Bushes ran on that as kind of their brand, their entrepreneurial backgrounds and so on. And
yeah, well, there's always this fantasy that the government would run so much better if you ran it like a business, which, sort of comes from an ignorance of how governments actually work.
Yeah,
Government, you can't really run government like a business, but if you're a business guy, you naturally think that that's something you should be able to do.
Well, not just as a business guy. I mean, I think a lot of people who are not business people think that way, and I think they neglect to make the to note the fact that, as I think anyone who's worked inside a business corporation, as I have, does, that corporations are run like dictatorships, in which there is, there's the chief gets to, axe his enemies, and there is no free speech, and the company owns all of your ideas, and so on. And so I think it's not a well thought through notion. And I think we're seeing some of the consequences of that now, especially when we have a kind of a sort of somebody who may not be a real CEO but plays one on TV. Yeah. I mean, there's a really interesting thing I read. I don't know if it was in one of the major national papers last week, that the president has been having all of the staff of the White House sign like corporate style non-disclosure agreements.
Yeah.
which the White House counsel has told everybody he thinks are unenforceable, but they sort of let them do them anyway. And it's kind of crazy because it's a profoundly chilling approach to speech, to political speech, which is the kind of the most sacrosanct kind of speech in the, in First Amendment jurisprudence. And, and living in a society, that's constructed off, these lattices of confidentiality agreements in which the sins of the powerful are sort of bought into secrecy and perpetuity. Agreements which often probably would be proven not to be enforceable were they tested, but they never are because it's too expensive and too scary to try to fight the powerful in litigation. And, and that's kind of where we find ourselves. And, and then we'll soon be taking all of these contracts and, turning them into even more truly unbreakable contracts, like smart versions that run on the blockchain or something. That's the dystopian edition. Stay tuned.
Well, there's, I feel that the whole NDA thing is more part of the Trump administration's ongoing attempt to suppress disclosure of what's going on inside the administration. If prior administrations had non-disclosure agreements, the bookstore's politics section would be a lot thinner.
Totally. I mean, I have felt very strongly for quite a long time that the cultivation and hoarding of secrets is the most toxic and cancerous thing you can do in a democratic society, both at the governmental level and at the corporate level. And in both milieus, secrets are power, right? And secrets are the opposite of transparency, obviously, and sort of by definition they're, to me, incongruous with democracy. And I think you're right. This is just like the next level, and it's not. And every administration that came before, certainly since World War II, has been, taking a similar approach of sort of incrementally and sometimes in big steps, trying to expand the portion of the knowledge of the state, of the nation state, that's secret. And it didn't matter what the sort of partisan or political affiliation of the president was. It seems to continue.
It seems the disclosure of secrets, which I don't want to do any spoilers on your story, but that's involved getting the truth out, and it's been the savior of democracy a number of times. Things like the Pentagon Papers and the Nixon Oval Office, recordings, things like that. If they had been suppressed, we would be in a whole different situation.
Yeah, but those kinds of things will come out. I mean, the fact that people sign non-disclosure agreements, that's not necessarily going to stop leaks. I mean, the Pentagon Papers, that, I mean, he didn't have, he was violating he was violating the law, I think, by releasing those papers. Well, there was a big furor about that, but he released them anyway. So I don't think that the fact of having these like non-disclosure agreements or other constraints on speech and on leaks will necessarily be that effective in suppressing some ultimate releasing of the truth, because the truth tends to find its way out,
Yeah, it wants to find its way out, but it takes a lot of courage and a lot of sacrifice often.
Yeah, absolutely.
To happen. I mean, I worked when I was right out of law school. I spent a lot of time in Washington as a staff lawyer on the Senate Judiciary Committee, working with whistleblowers which is, as Scoop notes, there's a kind of a whistleblower angle to a kind of key thread of the story in Tropic of Kansas. But being a whistleblower is kind of a thankless task in a way. I mean,
it's also a dangerous one and expensive one.
Yeah, and one that the society on the one hand kind of claims to valorize, but then you look at how a lot of the whistleblowers are actually treated, and the impacts are usually pretty rough. I mean, even I look at a figure like Snowden, who on the one hand is this popular hero of millennial digital culture, and yet seems to be drifting into a kind of a marginalized life, as best I can tell from my vantage point. And I think that's pretty typical. And so until we kind of so figuring out ways to push at the laws that maintain secrets, and because you're right, John, usually they're protected by they're enforced by law, but laws can change, and often the way they change is when they're sort of tested to the limits, and something's got to give in the name of democracy.
You can learn more about Christopher Brown at ChristopherBrown.com. With John Lebkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Protopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.